Goodbye, My Darling Grace, by Terence Flannery. A knock so soft it did not want to be answered brought him to his bedroom door. He had fallen asleep with a book, and it was long after midnight in the big silent house where he was staying as a guest. There in the dim light of the hallway stood Grace, her eyes swollen with tears and face crushed with grief. He stepped back as she flung herself into his arms, sobbing, "Silver, Silver." This was a new voice he was hearing, not the playful, carefree voice he was used to whenever he had seen her in the house, but still holding him with her huge liquid eyes. There was an innocence and serenity about Grace that needed no words. He had first seen her when he came downstairs early that morning as she was cradling an aged grandma on the couch in the huge living room. He assumed she was a relative he had not yet met and said hello. She only smiled without speaking. After passing her several times later with only more smiles to show, and still not knowing who she was, he had finally asked her, half jokingly, "Do you speak? Can you speak?" She killed his wit with the slightest of nods. "Do you speak English?" he asked. She shook her head and parried, "Tagalog?" His turn to say no. So they would rely on smiles, it seemed. Later in the kitchen, he laughingly asked Joy, "Who is this person?" his chin jutting a little in the direction of Grace, who was across the room giving water to Grandma. Joy told him, "She's the new maid, Grace." Curiously, he asked Joy, "Does she know who I am? Does she know my name?" Joy tells him, "She calls you Silver because of your eyes. She says they're silver grey." It's as close to an introduction as he will get, and the exchange of smiles continues through the morning. He's a little unnerved by the way she locks on to him with her eyes as they pass, and soon they share the familiar knowing that comes from looking at someone too long without ever speaking. In no time he's finding reasons to pass by her wherever she is. Grace knows. She is elegantly slender in build, with an almost boyish figure, and delicate hands with their long fingers sculpting pictures in the air as she walks. Her dress is simple but stylish, and she wears one small diamond earring in her right ear. Of one thing he is sure: Grace is no maid. She is more than a little taller than average and far too young for him, already in his advancing years. If he looks at her, he knows it's just to live an impossible dream, without so much as a common language between them. But it's too late. He's enchanted, and yes, Grace knows. At midday, he willingly volunteers to drive her on an errand across town. It's said that time is a constant, never changing. With Grace beside him in the open car, her long raven hair in the wind, he entered a space without time, neither fast nor slow. It simply didn't exist. The errand done, he took the long coast road home beside the blazing white beaches littered with falling coconuts from the waving palms. Grace forced him to stop by reaching across and mischievously turning off the ignition and taking the keys, only laughing at his protests about safety. Leaping from the car, she ran barefoot across the sand to meet the waves of clear blue water lapping at the edge. Spreading her arms wide as if to embrace the whole ocean, she shouted long and passionately at the top of her voice up to the sky till she was empty, a sound he would never forget. When she turned breathless to face him, her eyes shone like the sun. They walked barefoot along the ocean's edge, with Grace running here and there like a child searching the sand. He thought she was looking for the prettiest shells until she excitedly screamed with delight. Running back to him, she presented her treasure. It was a blue crystal shaped like a star, the size of a silver dollar, which strangely had not been battered by the waves and still retained the polished sheen. She washed it in the sea and dried it on the hem of her dress. Though he did not know why, he could see the blue star crystal held a special meaning for her. In an almost private ritual, Grace pressed the crystal to her lips. Holding it to her heart, she stood perfectly still for a long time with her eyes closed, and then, through his open shirt, she pressed it to his own heart. With a shock at the touch of the star crystal on his chest, he physically felt a wave of emotion go through him, and Grace smiled knowingly, as she had clearly felt it too. Carefully she placed it into his open palm, and as if she were wrapping a great gift, she folded the fingers of his hand tightly around the crystal. She pressed his closed hand to her breast, and then in an instant the spell was broken, and she was gone, laughing and running along the water's edge until she stopped and turned, waiting for him to catch up. As they walked, she leaned into him and clung to his arm with both hands, as if afraid he might leave her, a thing that no power on earth could have made him do. When they finally returned to the house, passing through the gates and into the driveway, reluctantly he brought the car to a halt, knowing something precious was ending. Grace pushed herself onto his lap between the steering wheel and his body, long slender fingers cupping his face tenderly in her hands and looking deep into his eyes, and finally whispering, "Silver." With eyes wide open, she kissed him long and passionately on the mouth. The time warp they had been in ended abruptly as they crossed the threshold into the house, back into the ordinary world, each pretending a distance forever made impossible by the time spent together in the other world. Now here they were in his bedroom in the middle of the night, at the end of this, her first day in the house. In the soft shadows cast by the glow from the reading lamp, she sat on the edge of the bed, pulling him by both hands to sit by her side. Then came the outpourings of Tagalog and tears that were being torn from deep inside her, crying on and on. He protested, helplessly spreading his hands, palms up. Wait, darling Grace, how can I help you if I don't understand?" "Silver." She pressed her fingers to his lips, salty from her tears, to bring his silence and to make him see that some stories need to be told more than understood, that truly listening transcends words. Now he listened with his heart and eyes, and not just his head. Her voice was sometimes soft and husky, and other times full of passion and emotion. He held her hands in his and watched her relive whatever was causing her such agony, only knowing her pain, which cut her like a knife. He was seeing what she is feeling, not in images, not in moving pictures, but in waves of sorrow, anger, of distress and shame, and all the time being held by her eyes locked onto his. As she begins, she weeps quietly, and the tears fall steadily onto his hands. But as she sees again the worst moment about to happen, her terror builds as she relives it. She is wide-eyed with fear and racked with an anguish that has her sobbing deeply. Her hands are now gripping his with a strength beyond her own. Her eyes implore him to understand what she is feeling, and how can he not? As the storm subsided, she sank against him, her arms tight around him, and he felt her breath on his chest. He held her gently. She gripped him fiercely. In the soft light, he looked down on her head and shoulders as he stroked her long black hair, holding her to him. He told her everything will be all right, without knowing how he could ever promise such a thing. waiting and listening as her sobs subsided into steadier breathing, becoming regular and easy. Grace was feather light as he lifted her and laid her on the bed. When he tried to withdraw and leave her there, her grip on him tightened, eyes opening wide again in a wild panic, and so he lay down beside her. She turned into him, and he held her carefully in his arms as if she might break. Finally she fell into a troubled, shallow sleep, but always holding on to him, sensing if he tried to move away. Then came a need as she opened and drew him in, her open mouth searching for his. She murmured his name, Silver, Silver, urgently, followed by the softest of words and phrases spoken into his chest, which he could only wish to understand. He'd give his life to watch over her forever. But the light dims as his eyes grow heavy and he surrenders to sleep, his dream of eternal vigil over Grace. In the morning she was gone from the house, leaving only her scent in his bed and a cold hand on his heart. She was like the untouched sweetheart of his childhood, who, sick with boyish desire, and without her ever knowing, he had loved from afar. Grace had captured him with her eyes, pulled him deep into her veil of tears, and left on angel's wings. Standing outside the gates at the front of the house, he looked out along the empty early morning street, with the fingers of grey mist still clinging to the long grass, waiting for the sun. In a voice so soft it was scarcely his own, and overwhelmed by a longing no words could express, he heard himself whisper, "Goodbye, my darling Grace."